I've got a story that's been haunting me since it happened. I mean, this one is definitely for the books. This was a few years ago when I got a new job as a forest park ranger. It was my dream job, being out in nature and protecting the park. For the first couple of weeks, everything was perfect. But then, one dark and spooky night, everything changed. I had just moved into the small cabin provided for park rangers. It was cozy and located right in the heart of the forest, which I loved. My days were spent hiking the trails, checking for any signs of trouble, and making sure visitors were safe and following the rules. It was peaceful, and I felt like I had finally found my place. One evening, I was wrapping up my shift when I got a call on my radio. There was a report of strange noises coming from the eastern part of the park. It was getting dark, but I didn't think much of it. Probably just some animals, I thought. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to check it out. As I walked through the forest, the trees cast long shadows in the fading light. The further I went, the darker it got, and soon I had to rely on my flashlight to see the path. The air was cool, and the forest was really quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves. After about 20 minutes of walking, I reached the area where the noises were reported. I stopped and listened, but there was nothing. Just silence. I was about to radio back and report that it was probably just the wind when I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, coming from deeper in the woods. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight in the direction of the noise. There was no answer, just the soft whispering growing louder. My heart started to race, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was a lost hiker or someone playing a prank. I took a deep breath and followed the sound. The whispers led me to an old overgrown trail that I had never noticed before. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. As I stepped onto the path, the whispering stopped. I paused, second-guessing if I should continue. Something just didn't feel right, but I pressed on. The trail twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the darkness felt almost tangible. My flashlight flickered, and I tapped it, trying to keep it from going out. Then I saw a figure standing just ahead on the path. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. I took a few steps closer, shining my flashlight on them. It was a man, dressed in hiking gear that looked like it was from another era. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his eyes had a vacant, haunted look. "Sir, are you lost?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He just stared at me with those empty eyes. I felt a shiver run through me. Something was very wrong. Suddenly, the man turned and started walking down the trail. I hesitated for a moment but decided to follow him. Maybe he needed help and was going to show me where. I kept a few paces behind him, my flashlight flickering as I tried to keep up. The trail led us to a small clearing, and as we stepped into it, the man stopped and turned to face me. His eyes seemed to bore into mine, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Again, the man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the ground. I followed his gaze and saw a small, weathered sign sticking out of the earth. It was covered in moss, but I could just make out the words, "In memory of John Davis, missing since June of 1989. My heart skipped a beat. John Davis? That was the name of a hiker who had gone missing nearly 40 years ago. His disappearance was a local legend, but no one had ever found out what happened to him, and here he was standing right in front of me. Before I could say anything, the man, John Davis, started to speak. His voice was barely audible, like a whisper carried on the wind. "I've been lost for so long," he said, his eyes filled with sadness. "I can't find my way home." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that I was standing there talking to an actual ghost. I had no idea what to do. I had never believed in ghosts before, but there was no denying what I was seeing. "I'll help you," I said, trying to sound brave. "I'll help you find your way home." John nodded, and I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I didn't know how I was going to help him, but I knew I had to try. I asked him to show me where he had been hiking, and he led me further into the forest. As we walked, he told me about the day he went missing. He had been on a solo hike, exploring a new trail when he got lost. He wandered for days trying to find his way back, but the forest seemed to twist and turn, leading him in circles. He eventually collapsed from exhaustion and hunger, and that's when he died. "I've been wandering ever since," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I can't find peace." We reached another clearing and John stopped. He pointed to a spot on the ground, and I saw a small, makeshift grave marked by a pile of stones. It was his final resting place. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking. "I wish someone could have found you much sooner." John looked at me with those haunted eyes and smiled faintly. "Thank you for listening," he said, "and for helping me." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. I didn't know what else to say. I watched as John knelt beside his grave, and a soft light began to surround him. The air grew warmer, and I felt a sense of peace settle over the clearing. "Goodbye," he whispered, and with that he was gone. The light faded, and I was left standing alone in the clearing, the silence of the forest pressing in around me. I made my way back to the cabin, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I couldn't believe it. I had just spoken to a ghost. I reported what I had found to my supervisor the next day, and they sent a team to investigate. They confirmed that the human remains thought to be John Davis were found in the makeshift grave. His relatives were contacted and arrangements were made for a proper burial. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and the story of John Davis finally came to an end. But for me, it was just the beginning. I had always loved the forest, but now I saw it in a different light. There were mysteries hidden within its depths, and not all of them could be explained. I continued working as a park ranger for a while after that, but I never forgot that night. I often found myself thinking about John Davis and wondering how many other lost souls were out there, waiting to be found. So, if you ever find yourself alone in the forest, listen closely. You never know who or what might be trying to reach out to you. And remember, sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us, whether we're ready for it or not. My family and I went camping in late August a couple of years back. This camping trip turned out to be an experience I'll never forget. So, get comfortable and prepare for this spooky tale. My family loves camping. My mom, dad, little sister Hannah, and I have been camping every summer since I can remember. This time, we decided to try a new spot deep in the woods. We found a secluded area, set up our tents, and started a campfire. Everything was perfect. The weather was nice, and the forest was beautiful. Little did we know our peaceful night was about to take a terrifying turn. As the sun set and the forest grew darker, we roasted marshmallows and told stories around the campfire. The flickering flames cast long shadows, making the forest seem even more mysterious. After a while, Dad suggested we go for a short hike before bed. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down a narrow trail. We hadn't walked far when we stumbled upon something unexpected, an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for ages. The wooden walls were weathered and covered in moss, and the windows were broken. Hannah and I thought it looked really cool and convinced our dad and mom to let us explore it. As we approached the cabin, a creepy feeling washed over me. The air seemed colder, and the forest was unusually quiet. Dad pushed open the creaky door, and we stepped inside. The cabin was dark and musty, filled with old furniture covered in dust. It looked like no one had been there in a very long time. We split up to explore different parts of the cabin. Mom and Hannah went to check out a small room on the left, while Dad and I headed to the right. For some reason, I kept getting the feeling that we were being watched. It was really creeping me out, but I didn't say anything to my dad, and I tried to ignore it. Dad and I found a dusty old book on a table. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. As we flipped through it, We realized it was a diary. The entries were dated back to the early 1900s and belonged to a woman named Abigail. She wrote about her life in the cabin and how she lived there alone after her husband passed away. The last entry was strange. It mentioned hearing voices and seeing shadows. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from the other room. Dad and I rushed over to find Mom and Hannah standing in the doorway, their faces pale. They said they had seen something move in the shadows and knocked over an old chair in their panic. We decided it was time to leave the cabin and head back to our campsite. As we stepped outside, the temperature seemed to drop even more. The once clear sky was now covered with dark clouds, and the forest felt menacing. We hurried back to our campsite, trying to shake off the creepy feeling. We got into our tents, hoping to get some sleep. But the night was far from over. Late into the night, I was woken up by a strange noise. It sounded like someone talking, but I couldn't make out any words. I peeked out of my tent and saw a faint light coming from the direction of the cabin. I woke up Dad, and we decided to investigate. As we approached the cabin, the talking got louder. The light was coming from inside, flickering like candlelight. We cautiously stepped inside and saw something that made our blood run cold. A ghostly figure of an old woman standing in the middle of the room. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes and had a sorrowful expression on her face. "Who are you?" Dad asked, his voice trembling. The ghostly figure didn't respond. Instead, she pointed to the diary on the table. I grabbed it and flipped to the last page. There was a new entry, written in shaky handwriting. It said, "Help me find peace." We realized that the ghost was Abigail, and she was trapped in the cabin, unable to move on. We didn't know how to help her, but we knew we had to try. We spent the rest of the night reading through the diary, looking for clues. As dawn approached, we discovered a passage about a locket that Abigail's husband had given her. She wrote about how much it meant to her, and that she had buried it under a tree near the cabin. We decided to find the locket, hoping it would help her find peace. We searched the area around the cabin, and finally found the tree mentioned in the diary. We dug around the base and found a small metal box containing the locket. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry with a picture of Abigail and her husband inside. We returned to the cabin and placed the locket on the table. The ghostly figure of Abigail appeared once again, but this time she looked more at peace. She smiled at us and whispered, "Thank you." Then she slowly faded away, and the cabin grew warmer. We left the cabin, feeling a sense of relief. As we walked back to our campsite, the forest seemed friendlier, and the sun was starting to rise. We packed up our things and decided to head home early. We couldn't stop talking about what had happened and how we had helped Abigail find peace. That experience changed us all. We realized that there are things in this world that we can't explain. We still go camping, but we're more aware of our surroundings and the history of the places we visit. This happened a couple of years ago when my friends and I decided to go on a camping trip in a forest not too far from where we lived. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing weekend, but it turned into a nightmare that none of us will ever forget. It was me, Paul, Sarah, and Emily. We were all excited to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life and spend some time in nature. We loaded up Paul's SUV with all our gear and headed out early on a Friday morning. The drive was beautiful, and we chatted and laughed the whole way there. When we arrived at the forest, we found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall trees, with a little stream running nearby. We pitched our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be an amazing weekend. During the day, everything was perfect. We hiked, swam in the stream, and explored the forest. The scenery was breathtaking, and we felt so alive and connected to nature. As the sun began to set, we started a campfire and roasted marshmallows, sharing stories and laughing until our sides hurt. As night fell, the forest took on a different vibe. The cheerful sounds of birds and critters were replaced by the eerie silence of the night. We were still having fun, but there was a sense of unease that we couldn't quite shake. We brushed it off, thinking it was just our imaginations running wild. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We put out the fire and crawled into our tents. I was sharing a tent with Paul, while Sarah and Emily were in the other tent. The sounds of the forest at night were a little unsettling, but I managed to fall asleep after a while. Sometime later, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It sounded like someone was walking around our campsite. I lay still, straining to hear. Paul was still asleep, snoring softly on the other side of the tent. The footsteps got closer, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I thought it might be a deer or some other animal, but there was something about the way the footsteps moved that made me uneasy. I slowly unzipped the tent and peeked out. My heart nearly stopped when I saw a figure standing by the dying embers of our campfire. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild, unkempt hair and a crazed look in his eyes. He was just standing there, staring at our tents. I quietly shook Paul awake, whispering to him about the man outside. Paul's eyes widened in fear, and we both silently debated what to do. Just then, we heard a scream from Sarah and Emily's tent. The man had moved closer to their tent, and Sarah must have seen him through the fabric. Paul and I scrambled out of our tent, grabbing the first things we could find to use as weapons. Paul had a sturdy branch, and I grabbed a heavy flashlight. We rushed over to Sarah and Emily's tent, shouting at the man to get away. The man turned to look at us, and for a moment I thought he might attack. But then he let out a maniacal laugh and took off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We were all shaken, our hearts pounding in our chests. We huddled together, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We decided to stay up for the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch. But none of us could sleep, too scared that the man might come back. As the first light of dawn began to break, we felt a little safer, but we knew we couldn't stay there another night. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, eager to get out of the forest and back to civilization. As we were loading the last of our things into the SUV, we heard a noise behind us. We turned to see the man standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those same crazed eyes. We didn't waste any time. We jumped into the SUV and sped down the dirt road, our hearts racing. It wasn't until we were miles away from the forest that we finally started to relax. We reported the incident to the local authorities, but they didn't find any trace of the man. For weeks after, we were all haunted by nightmares of that night. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, even when we were safe at home. It took a long time for us to feel normal again, and we never went camping in that forest again. Years later, I heard a story that made my blood run cold. There were rumors about a man who lived in those woods, a man who had lost his mind after his family died in a tragic accident. Some said he believed the forest was his, and that anyone who entered it was trespassing. Others claimed he was a ghost, forever haunting the place where he had died. I don't know if any of those stories are true, but I do know one thing for sure. I won't be visiting that creepy forest anytime soon, and I know my friends won't either. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out on more spine-chilling tales. Subscribe now for weekly scares. Hit that red button and join our journey into the unknown.